Hi my friends! Today I will show you how to draw a basket digitally. The first thing that I did was to find my inspiration. I was not particularly familiar in absolute detail how a basket is constructed, so I went onto the internet. That's a great place to start to search for images. But in other occasions, I might also look through my personal images or look around me and see if there's something like that object. When I'm selecting the inspiration, I also try to keep an eye on my composition of the artwork and the perspective of the object. You want to make sure that it fits into your overall artwork. Once you found the ideal image, you want to bring it over into your favorite software. I'm using here Adobe Photoshop. The next thing is to build the object. You try to think 3D, or also how the object is actually constructed and made in real life. I've never made a basket, though I do a lot of crafts, leather craft, and also you just get familiar at some point with the techniques that are used. So to make a basket, I imagined there was use of wood and wood-like materials that are woven into each other. So I tried to replicate that with my brush. The brush that I selected here is a hard round brush, but I flattened it so that it gives that illusion of how these strands of material are sort of woven into each other and building that basket. I followed the lines on the image to first start off and start creating that basket, to construct the basket, if you will. You might also have noticed that I keep changing the angle of the brush because that allows me to more accurately represent the lines I'm following. Usually I would also recommend to separate your layers for each of the elements that you're drawing, but in this case, because there's so many strands of this material, I just did it separated more by rows and by sections rather than each single strand being a separate layer. Even if I had numbered them, that would not have helped me to really know which strand I'm looking at. Sometimes the object that you're drawing is not fully visible in the image that you've selected. In those cases, just like you see me do here, just try to the best of your ability to extend it as you would imagine it to look like. The colors that I used at this point are not hugely important because they can still be changed afterwards. But for my own benefit and so that I can differentiate the areas a little bit better, I kind of already started thinking which are the areas that are a little bit more elevated in the basket, hence a bit lighter, and which ones are a bit darker. And so you see here that I'm using primarily three brown tones. The one in the center is a little bit lighter because that's the sort of the area where the basket is sort of most elevated. So that one's a little bit lighter for that reason. And remember when you're doing this that we're only trying to create the illusion of a basket, so the shape of this is the most important thing, that we get that feeling of a basket. It doesn't have to be absolutely exactly as it is drawn there. On a side note, why am I drawing a basket, you wonder? Well, I was doing an art commission that was going to be used for a wedding gift, and the art commissions that I do, I usually combine the cultural aspects of the couple, and to add more personality, of course, I include some of their favorite things or hobbies. And the hobby of the bride in this case was mushroom picking, so I ended up drawing mushrooms and this basket that you see me do here with mushrooms in it that were already collected. That in itself is one of the things I love most about drawing art commissions, because you end up learning so many marvelous things that I'm not yet familiar with, and it requires a little bit of research before I can draw the subject, but that's sort of like my window to the world, if you will. And when I'm drawing it, I'm actively thinking about that hobby or that subject, and my mind starts to wander in this like imaginative realm. And through commissions, I have been able to discover so many different cultures like Canada, Vietnam, Norway, and also some hobbies like kickboxing, motorbikes, American football, and so much more in between. So even if you are just curious to, travel a bit with your mind, have a bit of an imaginative journey, drawing can be a beautiful place to start. Now in terms of the drawing, the next thing to do is we want to make it look as if these strands of wood are woven into each other. Mostly I was using the magic wand for this and then the eraser, but in some cases I would also just use the eraser and do it manually to change a little bit of the shape of the strands as well. The next thing that I did was to build the underlying layer slash the background. This is technically still giving the basket shape, but we're now focusing on what's underneath. The basket has these sort of supporting horizontal bars made out of wood, and underneath that is mostly just shadows, so you just see me adding a darker brown here to emulate that. Now back to fine tuning, I still had a lot of strands that were sort of overlapping and really didn't look woven into each other. So you see me there using the magic wand, and what that helps me do is I can select one layer, in this case it was the dark brown, select it with the magic wand, and then go to the mid brown layer, so one row above, and delete whatever was overlapping between them. You see me now repeating the same process, just with the rows higher, so the mid brown tones and the light brown tones. And that just helps clean up the edges and it starts to look more woven into each other. Now there are some sections that are very tight or that didn't clean up properly, so I went there again manually with the eraser, just a normal shape eraser, and cleaned up any areas that looked either unrealistic or should be visible to make this work. At this point I was pretty happy with how the basket was turning out, and so I decided to remove our background image, the image that we have been using for inspiration, and that's when we start noticing if there's any holes, so I needed to continue to fill out the background a little bit more. Finally, we are going to create now some depth, and this is where your artwork starts to become more real, when you start getting excited. And so what I use for this one, so far I've been using a hard round brush. It was flattened and sometimes not flattened, so depending on the area. And now I'm going to choose a soft round brush. I leave the opacity usually as is. If your tool allows you to select that the pressure of your brush determines the size or the opacity, you can play with those around, see what works best for you. And now we want to create shadows and light. That's what's going to give the illusion of this being a three-dimensional object and the depth of it. And so the key thing here is to imagine which are the areas that are going to get hit most by light, and which are the areas that are going to be darker and more hidden underneath, potentially as well other objects. So you see me do that here, applying the shadows in specific areas. And with shadows as well, you might want to go over a certain area more than one time with a soft round brush, because it kind of builds on itself. Shadows, if you look all around you, you will see that it's not necessarily one hard shadow. It can have multiple layers, and it can have sort of like different levels of spreading, meaning that certain areas are a bit lighter than others. So keep all of that in mind when you're adding the illusion of shadows and lights. That now concludes the basket, but now we have to create little mushrooms to go into the basket, and I will show you that in part 2 of this video, where I will go a little bit more in detail about creating depth and how I create textures on mushrooms. See you there, bye!